we are taught a very simple story about war. That war is a tragedy, a mistake, a breakdown of leadership and diplomacy. We're told that as nations become richer, more educated, and more connected, war should slowly disappear. That progress naturally leads to peace. And on the surface, that story sounds reasonable. After all, why would the most powerful nations on Earth, nations with advanced economies, sophisticated institutions, and decades of experience, keep repeating something so destructive? Yet when you look at history, something doesn't quite add up. The countries with the most influence, the most resources, the most strategic intelligence are often the very ones drawn back into war again and again, not once, not accidentally, but repeatedly. And that contradiction is hard to ignore. And this is where the story stops being comfortable. Because if war were simply a failure, a sign of incompetence or irrational behavior, you would expect powerful nations to be the best at avoiding it. They have the most to lose. They have the most information. They have the most tools to resolve conflict without violence. And yet, they don't seem very good at staying out of it. This isn't about morality, and it's not about blaming individual leaders. It's about something deeper, because patterns don't repeat by accident, and systems don't behave randomly at scale. When the same outcome keeps appearing across different countries, different eras, and different political systems, it's usually not because everyone made the same mistake. It's because they're operating inside the same structure, a structure that quietly rewards certain outcomes and makes others extremely difficult to sustain. Because once you see this pattern, you can't unsee it. So before we ask whether war is good or bad, justified or unjustified, there's a more uncomfortable question we need to sit with first. What if war isn't simply something that happens to powerful nations? What if it's something that emerges from the way power itself is organized? And once that possibility enters the picture, the story of war starts to look very different. Because this isn't a story about chaos, it's a story about order. And you can feel this contradiction in the way we talk about war. When war happens, we treat it like a glitch, like something that interrupts normal life. We say, the world has gone crazy, as if chaos suddenly broke into an otherwise stable reality. But if it keeps happening, across centuries, across continents, across different ideologies, at some point, it stops looking like a glitch. It starts looking like a feature. Think about it like this. If a company keeps making the same mistake every few years, it's usually not a mistake. It's an incentive, something that pays off in a way outsiders don't immediately see, because systems don't run on what we wish were true. They run on what gets rewarded. And the most dangerous systems are the ones that feel moral on the surface while quietly operating on a different set of rules underneath. Rules that don't show up in speeches or school textbooks. That's why the most important clues aren't in what superpowers say. They're in what superpowers do, consistently, especially when pressure rises. So the real question isn't whether war is tragic. Of course it is. The real question is why tragedy keeps returning to the same places, at the same moments, as if something invisible is pulling the same lever. Most explanations of war focus on people, a bad leader, a reckless decision, a failure of communication, an emotional response taken too far. And sometimes those explanations are true, on the surface. We're taught to believe that if only the right people were in charge, if diplomacy were handled better, if cooler heads prevailed, war could always be avoided. It's a comforting belief. At first glance, this explanation feels convincing because it suggests that war is optional, that it's the result of poor choices rather than structural pressure. But there's a problem with that idea. If war were primarily caused by individual failure, then over time we should see less of it. Leaders would learn, institutions would improve, mistakes would become rarer. Yet that's not what we see. Instead, we see war reappear in cycles, different justifications, different enemies, different slogans, but strikingly similar timing. And that raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if war isn't driven by irrationality, but by rational incentives embedded in the system itself? Because systems don't care about intention, they care about outcomes. A system rewards behaviors that keep it functioning, even if those behaviors look destructive from the outside. And when a system becomes too complex, too indebted, or too constrained, it begins to resist peaceful solutions. not loudly, not visibly, but quietly, through pressure. Pressure that builds until something gives. But this is exactly where most people stop thinking. At that point, war no longer appears as a failure. It appears as a release valve, a way to reset dynamics that have become politically impossible to address in peacetime. This doesn't mean anyone wakes up one morning wanting war. It means the system gradually narrows the set of viable options until war becomes one of the few remaining moves left on the board. And once you start looking at war through that lens, the question shifts. It's no longer, why did they choose war? It becomes, what made every other option stop working? And this is why the bad leader explanation only gets you so far. Because leaders change, parties change, ideologies change. Some leaders are careful, others impulsive. Some are popular, others hated. Yet the pattern survives them. That alone should make you pause. It's like blaming a traffic accident on one driver while ignoring the fact that the road is designed with a blind corner, no lights, and a speed limit no one can realistically follow. Yes, drivers make choices, but the environment shapes what choices are likely. The same is true here. When an economy is squeezed, when people feel stuck, when the political cost of reform becomes too high, leaders don't have unlimited options. They have options that keep them in power, and options that remove them. So even if a leader personally dislikes war, they may still drift toward it, not out of madness, but out of constraints. And once the public is afraid, once the narrative is simplified, once everything becomes national security, the space for peaceful reform shrinks even further. That's the part most people miss. War doesn't just happen because someone chooses violence. War happens when the system quietly makes peace feel impossible. To understand war, you don't start by asking who's right or wrong. You start by asking when. And this is the part most people never look at, because timing reveals more than ideology ever could. When you look closely, major wars tend to emerge during very specific conditions, not when systems are thriving, but when they're strained, when growth slows, when debt rises, when promises made in the past can no longer be kept. These are moments when leaders face a quiet dilemma. They can either confront structural problems directly, which often means political backlash, loss of power, and social instability, or they can redirect pressure outward. And this is where war begins to make sense, not morally, but mechanically. War reframes economic limits as security needs. It transforms financial constraints into national emergencies. It turns internal tension into external focus. And most importantly, it creates urgency. Urgency justifies actions that would be impossible in normal times. Massive spending, rapid industrial mobilization, extraordinary policy measures. Things that would be rejected in peacetime suddenly become necessary. And this isn't random. It's a pattern that repeats because it works. From the perspective of the system, war absorbs excess capacity. It reorganizes labor. It consolidates power. And it does something else that's even more important. It simplifies complexity. Once you notice the timing, everything else starts to make sense. In times of war, uncertainty shrinks into a single narrative. One enemy, one objective, one direction. For systems struggling under their own weight, that simplicity is incredibly useful. So when war appears, it's rarely a surprise to the structure itself. It's often the result of long building pressure finally finding a release. And once you see that pattern, war stops looking like a random tragedy. It starts looking like a recurring function. Here's the simplest way to see it without getting lost in theory. In normal times, governments have to negotiate. They have to justify spending. They have to convince people. They have to admit trade-offs. But in crisis times, everything changes. When a society is under stress, people tolerate actions they would reject in peacetime. They accept higher debt, more control, more surveillance, more sacrifice. And war creates the most powerful form of crisis. It turns complicated economic pain into a clear emotional story. We are threatened. We must act. That story is incredibly efficient because it pulls millions of people into one direction at once, psychologically and economically. It's like hitting a giant reset switch that forces coordination. And once a superpower experiences how effective that reset can be, it becomes tempting to use it again when the system starts choking on its own contradictions. Not because war is pleasant, but because it's decisive. So when you ask when, you're not asking a trivia question. You're reading the system's heartbeat. And if the heartbeat speeds up under certain pressures, you can predict what comes next, even before the headlines do. War solves problems that peaceful systems struggle to solve. This is where the system reveals what it actually values, not because it's efficient, but because it bypasses resistance. First, war jumpstarts economies. It unlocks spending at a scale that no political debate could ever approve. It reactivates industries. It creates jobs instantly. Entire sectors that were stagnant suddenly have purpose again. Second, war reorganizes power. Alliances become clear. Hierarchies reset. Leadership is reaffirmed or replaced. After major wars, the global order doesn't return to normal. It's redesigned. And third, war controls attention. When an external enemy exists, internal fractures become less visible. Questions about inequality, debt, and systemic failure fade into the background. The narrative tightens, and systems crave that kind of focus. This doesn't mean war is good. It means war is effective at sustaining systems that are otherwise approaching their limits. Peace demands reform. War demands obedience. Peace exposes flaws. War postpones them. And this is why peace is often harder than war. And that's why war keeps returning. Not because leaders love it, but because systems rely on it when other mechanisms fail. And notice how this works in everyday terms. In peacetime, every major change faces friction. People argue. Industries resist. Budgets stall. Political opponents block it. War cuts through all of that. It creates a single priority so dominant that everything else becomes secondary. And when everything is secondary, power can move fast. That speed is part of the appeal. It's the same reason some organizations only fix themselves when a disaster hits. Suddenly, meetings happen, decisions get made, resources appear out of nowhere. The crisis didn't create capability, it revealed what was always possible, but politically inconvenient. War does that on the scale of nations. It's also why war is so effective at producing technological acceleration, not because people suddenly become smarter, but because the usual barriers are removed. Funding becomes limitless, timelines compress. Failure becomes acceptable as long as progress is fast. And once a system learns that war can mobilize society like nothing else, it becomes a tool sitting on the table, even if no one admits it. That's what makes this so unsettling. The system doesn't need leaders who love war. It only needs leaders who understand what war can do when the alternatives stop working. None of this makes war just. And it doesn't make it inevitable in a moral sense, but it does make it understandable in a structural one. This isn't the conclusion people usually expect. As long as power is organized this way, as long as economies rely on growth without limits, as long as political systems struggle to reform themselves peacefully, war will remain an option, not the first choice, but the final one. So superpowers don't ask how to avoid war forever. They ask when war becomes unavoidable, and that question tells you everything you need to know about how the system really works. So what do you do with a truth like this? Not panic, not cynicism, and not blind optimism either. The point isn't to say, war is coming, so nothing matters. The point is to see the machinery clearly, because clarity is power. When you understand that war often functions as a systemic reset, you start noticing the signals that appear before the reset is pulled. You start watching pressure points, economic stress, political gridlock, legitimacy crises, internal fragmentation, because those are the conditions under which the system begins searching for a shortcut. And that's the uncomfortable part. To the system, war can look like a shortcut. It compresses decision-making. It overrides debate. It forces alignment. But for ordinary people, it's never a shortcut. It's the cost. And once you understand this, you start seeing the world differently. So the real question becomes personal. If superpowers keep returning to war when pressure rises, then what should individuals pay attention to when the pressure rises? Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And if you can't unsee it, you're no longer just consuming headlines. You're reading the structure beneath them.